Hi, I'm Andrea Kalin, creative director and writer on The People's Recorder. When we sat down with author David Bradley, we knew we were in for an unforgettable conversation. David's sharp and he's funny and deeply thoughtful. He brought both wit and a grounded perspective to his take on the legacy of the Writers' Project. He didn't hold back in his skepticism either, especially when it came to the Pennsylvania Guide. A lot of it was written by people in Philly who didn't know anything about the flyover parts, he told us. And he also reminded us that even well-meaning projects can miss the mark when they overlook who's doing the storytelling and what gets left behind. David was quick to point out that the project's primary goal wasn't cultural, it was economic. It was about getting people back to work during the Great Depression. Still, listening to David, you got the sense that he saw real value in what the guides were trying to do, capturing a country mid-sentence, trying to describe itself while still becoming itself. At one point, he joked that I had more energy than the Energizer Bunny, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. We kept going and going and going, and after a long, rich interview, the crew capped the day with dinner at a historic landmark in Bedford. It was a stone building that dates back to 1762, where farmers raised a liberty pole to protest the whiskey tax, and where Washington's troops are said to have camped on their way north. Maybe even Washington stopped in himself. Over dinner, something else came through. David's deep reverence for history, and for the idea that stories shape how we see a place, and that history depends on who gets remembered. It was especially powerful to learn that the Chaneysville Incident grew out of David's mother's research into local graves of runaway slaves. That personal link to buried history frames his novel's quiet force and his lasting belief in the power of stories to reveal what the official record often leaves out. For David, I came to appreciate that place isn't just where history happened, it's where it still lives.
Okay, so David, we're starting in the context of the 30s, in the Great Depression. What was it about the Depression that it was not just an economic crisis, but it hit people in a very personal way, and a sense of shame that was also very personal, and not just this national catastrophe?
The Depression was a shock. It was the proof that what we had been doing as a nation just did not work. People looked down on people who got welfare, looked down on people who needed assistance from outside, who, self-reliance and all that. This was a situation in which you had to have help. And it changed the way people saw the government. It changed what people expected from the government. In the rural areas, it was better in a sense because there was food. I mean, you could always grow your own food. But in a larger sense, just the idea that the government was now going to be able to come in, change things. People in this county were moved. They had poor farmland, and the government bought it and moved them out. And the government was intruding on life.
And you had said, let's deconstruct the expectations of people had changed too. So what was that shift? What was that transformation?
The expectations, especially here, was that the government was going to stay the hell out of your business. This is Whiskey Rebellion area. We didn't like the government coming in. And all of a sudden, the government not only brought help, but the government brought intrusion. They had to take it. In a way, it made people more conservative. But this was necessary. This was how you had to survive. I think that feeling of suddenly being dependent on this government thing out there that nobody had ever really paid much attention to. I mean, they didn't build roads. They didn't do those things. The government, and there was a big deal when the government forced all the highways to have numbers. Nobody liked that, And all of a sudden, this was where things were coming from. And with that came the idea that these people could intrude on you. And it was not liked.
Was there a breaking in process? I guess it's by force and by necessity. How else would they accept kind of this intrusion, as you call it?
The entire country was concerned about suddenly being beholden, and that there were going to be these huge agencies that did not necessarily know how things were done where you were, who were going to come in with guidelines. I mean, it's still true today. They come in with guidelines that just don't fit. And again, people had to accept certain things. You can't build a highway with local resources. You can't build the turnpike, for example. I mean, that was state resource, but you can't do that with local resources. So you need these things. It doesn't do any good to have a great highway in one county. I mean, it just, okay, who's going to get there? So as a result, people were forced to a sort of federal view of life that they had not had. They had a Confederate view of life.
And in this federal view also arose various different projects. One that we're looking at, the Federal Writers Project. In your words, tell us a story or give us a story on how that was conceived and how that was actually, that idea was born.
Oh boy. That was like almost everything that the government does that works, it worked by accident. Nobody really cared about writers. Writers were an afterthought because, what does a writer need? He needs a pencil and a tablet. It's much more fun to have musicians and orchestras and stuff like that, and some theater. Anything with drama. It's like have guys in a room sitting there with a pencil. But what happened with that program was because they were focusing on regional areas with the guides. They did a series of guides for each state, decentralized to those states. Those guides took on a flavor of that region because it was done by people in the region. And some of those regions had no writers. People had to learn to be writers, but, it was federal make work, but it was money, so be a writer for money? Sure, In the case of Pennsylvania, most of the writing was done in Philadelphia. And it was a very centralized sort of operation, which shows up here because this part of the state, the western part of the state, has always had a bad relationship with the eastern part of the state. I mean, it went to war on a couple of occasions. And when you read the guides and you see how local people are treated, local customs are sort of treated in different regions of the state, you can get a feel for what was going on regionally in the country. And that was something else that was happening because this country had been Confederate. States had a lot of power before the Depression.
What spurred that interest in this regionalism? So when the FWP was started and the idea came to do guidebooks, do you think that was just an idea that was born out of the political chaos? Was it much more contemplated? Was it indicative of a trend that was happening? Where did that kind of come from to create these guidebooks?
I think the decentralization of everything is built into the Constitution. When you start talking about roads, you start talking about projects, then you start talking about pork. And it's always a fight in the Congress. The lower down in the Congress you go, you got 2 senators, you got 3 million congressmen. Everybody's fighting for a little piece of the pie. Everybody wanted money. I mean, everybody wanted something for their region. So that's how it got decentralized, just to keep people on board. I mean, the Depression era legislation was an incredible coalition. Everybody had to be paid off in some way. And the government was very shaky at that time in terms of having it wasn't like Republicans and Democrats. It was regional, the Texans, and everybody was fighting with everybody. So, you really had to make sure that every little area got a little something. And that's part of the reason that it was a regional effort. U.S. senators in the states were not going to go along with, I don't get anything.
But why guidebooks?
I think they did guidebooks because the one thing that every state had was roads. People always moved. You had to get the stuff to market. You had to move across these regions. And during that period, there was an increasing sense of not so much tourism, but just travel, that you would go someplace for a little while and come back, as opposed to the previous era when you would go someplace and stay and maybe write a letter back. This region was on the main line of the Lincoln Highway, which was the first paved highway that went across the country. It was the first time you could get in your Model T and just go. So that consciousness was sort of growing. The roads used to have names. And the federal government said, we're going to give them all numbers. So there was a sense of a system, even when some of that system didn't exist. There were little dotted lines on the map. So Route 30 was something that people saw as going that way, and Route 66 and all those different famous numbers were part of a consciousness that was changing as people started buying cars, and that shift.
It became quintessentially American, the road.
The road.
Concept of the road.
This area had always been a crossroads. As people became more in control of their own travel, the train went when the train went, but your car went when you went. I mean, that was so American, you just couldn't get right down to it. Yeah, okay, let's just get in the car and go. We'll do it. We'll control it. Then things sprung up along the roads. I mean, everybody who wanted to make a living, well, people were coming through. Let's put up something weird. We'll put up a building that looks like a coffee pot. We'll put up a building that looks like Paul Bunyan. We'll put up, anything to make people stop and spend their money. And that was a tremendous change, because before that, people pretty much knew where they were and didn't know much else. 30 miles was a big trip.
So what opportunity did this kind of instigate, or what kind of opportunity did it open up?
One of the important things about the Federal Writers Project was just do the multiplication. How many writers are suddenly going to be needed? I mean, it's very easy to multiply the number of shovel carriers. I mean, everybody can use a shovel. But all of a sudden, in 48 states, you needed a certain number of writers. First of all, they weren't all there. Some states were like lousy with writers. Boston was lousy with writers. Massachusetts, New York was lousy with writers. DC was lousy with lots of things. But Pennsylvania wasn't so lousy with writers. And Kansas, Idaho, places like that, just like what are you gonna bus them in? No, we don't have buses. So suddenly there were people who were encouraged, if they'd had any inclination. And there are always these people who are just local and they're just writing a little something. They're not really thinking about anything national, anything big, anything even published. But all of a sudden, you're going to be working for something that is national in scope. Even if it's regional in nature, it's national in scope. There's an organization, there's a bullpen, and most importantly, there are other writers. Because writers tend to work individually. And all of a sudden, there was this concept, there are other people doing the same thing that I'm doing, and we're all getting paid, which helps. But people came together in ways where writers usually don't. Usually, if you are a writer, you know other writers more or less at your level. The Federal Writers Project brought people together, and they were different kinds of people, like Margaret Walker and Nelson Algren. There was a young black woman who was just not going to have the opportunity to have contact with an older, established white male writer. I mean, it's just, now it's kind of hard to bring about. And yet here they were, and she was able to learn from him, and vice versa, I'm sure. But it certainly impacted on her work. I mean, that poem, For My People, is one of the most powerful pieces in American literature. No, it wasn't supported by the federal writers. It's not state art, but it was certainly fostered by the idea that I'm part of something, that I'm not out here by myself, and that when I do write, somebody is going to see it. Because that's the other fear writers have. They're just, okay, I do this stuff, and does it go anywhere? Do they see it? No. Often not. And that never stops. So the project changed that dynamic for a lot of people who are right on that cusp of either being able to go on or not being able to go on, or giving up or not being able to do it because they didn't have any money. I don't think there's been a time when so many people were paid to write who were artistic writers as opposed to journalists. And there was a difference between the people who were journalists and who were accustomed to this kind of thing, and the Pennsylvania Guide shows this. That's a really kind of a journalistic approach to a lot of things. And some of them were so quirky that to this day, people will pick up those books and say, oh my God. The state guides were sent to servicemen who were serving, in the Pacific. This is what's happening at home. And people like that.
Speaking of which, it's that sense of identity then that was coming through these guides. And how do you think the project helped shape that? And did they know that that's perhaps what one of the outcomes would have been, is the sense of forging an identity that's both national and regional?
I don't believe that the federal government, just because it's so large, I don't believe that the serendipitous outcomes, the positive serendipitous.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation, but there is more where that came from. To hear the full interview, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support will help keep the stories coming and out in the world where they belong. Learn more in the show notes or on our website, peoplesrecorder.info. Thank you for your support. This is Chris Haley. Thanks for listening.